On October 18th of 2016, I stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. More so like I stood in the room where the National Civil Rights Museum is now today, where they allow you to walk through the room and pierce through the glass where you see where Dr. King last laid. It would have been 48 years before where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King checked into the same hotel right after giving his famous speech, "I've been to the mountaintop." Many of those who were close to him recognized that he knew that his time was coming to an end. And in this speech on April 3rd of 1968, indeed, turned out to be the last one that we would hear from him before he'd meet Jesus. Dr. King would be 96 years old today, 4 years younger than the recently passed President Jimmy Carter. And interestingly enough, the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech would prove to be prophetic and symbolic of some sorts. As many of you know, we've been preaching through the book of Exodus, and today as I approach Exodus 11 and 12, we're at the precipice of the Exodus narrative. This same portion of the biblical narrative is what Dr. King alludes to 5 times in his last speech. A speech where he testifies of God's deliverance, him delivering the people from their oppression. A speech where he testified and gave the instructions for God's people what they ought to do as they move towards this deliverance. And lastly, a speech where he reveals the contentment in his own heart that he had found during the disastrous delay in God's deliverance. Today, in a room that looks like what Dr. King testified would come, we're getting to talk about this same God's deliverance, and ultimately a deliverance that comes after a time of delay. More specifically, I hope to provide you all with some practical aid. Some practical aid for when you are experiencing your delay and when God's deliverance shows up, why it is ultimately worth the wait. So Exodus chapter 7 through 10. Pastor Dave preached last week on the beginning of the plagues when we know that the Nile was struck and turned to blood. He preached on the beginning of the plagues and gave an overview of all of the kinds of plagues and what Egyptian god Moses was attacking when God performed those plagues. So in 7 through 10, we see Moses going back and forth from God and Pharaoh, and conversations with God and Pharaoh. And what the conversations look like when he gets to Pharaoh's courts is, hey, God said, let my people go so that they may worship me. And plague after plague, Pharaoh's like, nah, I'm not going to do that. And then sometimes after a plague was serious enough, he'd say, okay, that really hurt us. I'll let you go, but you can't go too far. Matter of fact, in Exodus 8:28, that's what he alluded to. But then in chapter 10, verse 10 through 11, he goes a little bit further and says, look, okay, that last plague, that hit us hard. I'll let you go, but only the men can go because y'all are clearly up to something. And then he gets even further after the livestock and everything had passed away, and he goes, all right, I'll let you go now. Yes, your men can go, your women, children can go, but the livestock got to stay. And each time Moses goes back and forth between Pharaoh and conversating with God, Pharaoh gets closer and closer to the end. So we skip ahead to the end today, where we see God's deliverance ultimately does come, and we see God confronting Pharaoh one more time with one more plague. Now, mind you, as Moses and Pharaoh are having this exchange, there's 9 plagues going down. And during these 9 plagues, one thing was certain, 2 things for sure. All of Egypt suffered during some of these plagues. All of Egypt, including the animals, including the water, including the land, all of Egypt, including the Israelites, in some cases. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because this is clearly a battle between God and him humbling Pharaoh. Not even really a battle, but more like God just demolishing Pharaoh and all the Egyptian gods. But while this exchange is happening, guess what's also happening? The Israelites are experiencing the effects of this plague. They are waiting day in and day out. They're still in the field. They're still lifting the bricks. They're still making the stuff, whatever they were doing, building pyramids, you call it, whatever, building statues. They're still enslaved. But their promise had already been given. So Israel is catching some strays here. During this delay, Israel is not forgotten by God. But they are required to wait just a little bit longer. Now, I must admit, as I was preparing this sermon and I'm reading through Exodus and I'm thinking about the day to come, I must admit that it felt a little eerie for me to be reflecting on how a government system, a political power like Pharaoh, could sell lies that he would let people experience freedom, all the while knowing that he was wanting to place limitations on said freedom. I must admit that it felt a little eerie for me to reflect on the fact that this is the same kind of thing that Dr. King, in his last speech, was talking about. If I had an honest person in the room, a witness in the room, they'd be willing to say that this does sound like I'll let you go, but there's some stipulations on your freedom. I'll let you go, but mass incarceration. I'll let you go, but redlining. I'll let you go, but stop and frisk. But that's not the point here. Pharaoh goes back and forth, lying like a rug, all the while Israelites are waiting on their deliverance, y'all. And their deliverance is delayed. Somebody would say like a frontier flight. While Pharaoh and government systems might make empty promises, God does not. So here comes his promise in Exodus 11, verse 1. The Lord says to Moses, "Yet one plague more I will bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt, and afterward he will let you go from here. And when he lets you go, he will drive you away completely. Yet one plague more." This is awesome news because this is the first time Moses is hearing of the end of the plagues. But he's also learning at the same time, simultaneously, that they got to endure at least one more. One more plague, one more day, one more delay. But that's okay, because the fundamental component of a promise is that it is yet to come, right? And we know that promises are not empty when they come from God's lips. So we, the people of God, yes, you too, we face our delay differently. We face our delay like a kid holding on to a "you said you will" from their parents. So yes, we must endure one more hiccup, one more setback, one more trying time, and one more delay. But realize that delays can birth within us the things necessary to make the deliverance much sweeter. So don't skip or rush or try to bypass the delay, because God is indeed up to something during the delay. See, these delays, as the natural order would testify, when you try to rush something that needs time to be properly developed, natural order would testify that premature delivery comes with its own setbacks, its own complications. And so what the delay is producing or looking to produce is sometimes more important than the delivery itself. So we hang out one more plague. And so if you find yourself in a season of delay, if you find yourself in a season of waiting for God's deliverance, if you find yourself struggling day and night and you cannot figure out why the Lord has you in the hardship that he has you in, I want to encourage you with some tools to endure your one more. Number one, see the bigger picture. Number two, seek to desire him more than you desire the deliverance. And number three, remember the gospel and see him fulfilling his promise. Real quickly, we'll see the bigger picture. Y'all, God didn't just want Israel out of Egypt. He wanted them out better than when they came in. Hear me loud and clear. When Israel went into Egypt by way of Joseph, Israel had nothing. Joseph, the brothers stripped his cloak off of him that dad gave, threw him in the pit, sold him into slavery half naked. He had nothing. No honor, no value, no dignity. He was going into slavery as a man despised. But if we look at verse 2, we see how God wants Israel to leave Egypt. In verse 2 of 11, it says, "Speak now in the hearing of the people, and that they ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor for silver, for gold, and for jewelry." So Israel's not coming in naked. They're not leaving naked. They're not leaving with no value or no dignity. They now are being seen by the Egyptians as people worthy enough for them to give to, people worthy enough that their God is powerful enough that they should value and give them everything that they need for their journey ahead. So they go in naked and despised, but they're coming out dignified. They're coming out with new clothes. They're coming out with silver and gold. They're coming out with, as we see later in the text, everything that they needed, that they asked for, the Egyptian people gave them. So maybe that delay is setting up for you to have just everything you need when you leave it. Now, I'm not talking about items in this world. I might be talking more so about when you are experiencing hardships and you go to the Lord and you are praying and you are asking him, Lord, to redeem me. Sometimes you find yourself at the foot of the cross. Sometimes you find yourself at the foot of the throne and you find yourself now in God's presence, where you're pleading for him to deliver you and rescue you, but what you actually get is more of him to be with you while you are in that delay. See, sometimes what he wants you to come out with, meaning more of him, is more important than you just leaving the delay itself. So they end up with gold, they end up with silver. And if you know the story, you know that the Lord also instructed them to have a feast before this. Before all this goes down, he tells them that they ought to have a feast unto him, the Passover that we celebrate now through the Lord's Supper. In this feast, they were told by God that you're going to eat everything. Don't leave nothing. And if there's any leftovers, burn it. So they got full stomachs. They leaving with new closets, a full stomach, and they leaving with all that they need in order to buy and exchange in the next territory that they may be going into. The Lord doesn't want them to leave the same way that they came in. So here's the bigger picture. which isn't just about how he wants to develop you in this delay, but the bigger picture could be that he also has the other people around you in mind. Look at verse 3. Verse 3 says that the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. There's a huge reality that while the Egyptians watch our God, Yahweh, destroy and tear down the idols of their day and their land, they begin now to shift their perspective on who the real God is. They begin to shift their perspective on who God's people are. They begin to shift their perspective on who Pharaoh is and his limited power. God wasn't just trying to fix the Israelites, he was fixing the Egyptians' sights. So a practical thing for me to ask myself when I'm in a delay and when I'm praying and I'm waiting and I'm begging the Lord for deliverance is what is it that is happening in this delay that he wants to give me before I leave? And another practical question that I can ask myself is, who around me is watching God do amazing things, extraordinary things, give me a new kind of hope and a new kind of peace and a new kind of patience? Who around me is watching this and is learning truths about Yahweh? Because maybe, just maybe, he's trying to fix their sights on him. As I said, number 2 is seek to desire him more than you desire the deliverance. And this is the idea that having him becomes more important than deliverance. Like when we are crushed, we oftentimes seek him. And we then grow to know him better. When we are bruised, we oftentimes develop a deeper trust for him. When we are weighed down, we oftentimes understand the greater suffering that Christ went through in a way differently than before we stepped into our own suffering. And when we have these hardships, they oftentimes produce within us a greater understanding of what Christ came to do. When we see the effects of sin in this world, and just how far it is willing to go, and just how lost folks are, we see just how far Jesus' restoration will go, just how much weight and burdens that Christ placed on his shoulders when he went to the cross. We see just how much really weighed him down to the point where he was bleeding blood, sweat, and tears in the garden. We see just how much his restoration cost. We see it differently when we're in our own struggles. Kind of like David when he was led to a cave. He really learned how to cry out. And now we repeat some of the psalms that he wrote in this cave. Because at his lowest, facing his hardship, during the delay, waiting for God's deliverance, he came to know the Lord in a very special way. So in these hardships, in this delay, we also learn to seek his face. Like Psalms 27 tells us, to seek his face. Your face, Lord, I will seek. Seek his face, not his hand, is a popular phrase that I've heard used so many times growing up. Seek his face, not his hand. Well, what are you talking about? Like, I need God to show up and do this thing right now. And you're going to tell me to seek his face, not his hand? I need the hand, the arm, the forearm, and all the strength of God. But God really does want us to seek his face more than we seek his hand. He really does want us to seek his personhood, his presence, his character. He really does just want us to know him like he knows us. And sometimes these hardships and these delays, when we're waiting on our deliverance, does push us to learn him better. And when that happens, it should push us to worship while we wait. Worship the Lord for who he is. Meditate on the things of God. Meditate on him. Meditate and serve. Lord, have mercy, serve. I don't know if any of y'all have been watching Pastor David and I's devotionals as we lead into tomorrow's inauguration, but in one of them, I was talking about how when we are waiting, there's an opportunity to serve, like a waiter or a waitress, not just sitting there waiting anxiously and counting the clock and thinking about how hard it is, but no, by getting lost in the fact that I am here to serve a purpose, getting lost in the fact that I can do what you are calling me to do, God, be in the hands and feet of Jesus. Worship him while you wait. And I know for some of us, when it feels like it's harder to pray when we're going through hardships, because maybe I've said that before. I've been praying for this for fill in the blank amount of times. But one of the things that's been so helpful for me in my walk is when I feel like I can't get a prayer through, I get a praise through. Turn on some worship music. Start singing of his goodness until I remember it. Start meditating and focusing on the fact that I ain't just talking to Pharaoh. I'm talking to God. Remember the gospel and see him fulfilling his promises. Where were you when the gospel found you? Where were you when Jesus came to you and lifted you out of the weight of your sin? Where were you then? Do you remember that moment? Do you remember moments that testify of that moment? Remember those, visualize those, meditate on those, reflect on those, not our worst case scenarios. A lot of us spend so much time meditating on the problem that when deliverance shows up, we don't even know what it looks like. Because we spend so much time meditating on the problem. But what if instead Psalms 1:2, meditate on his word day and night? If I Joshua 1:8, meditate on his word day and night, and then I might be able to, Hebrews 10:23, hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, remembering that he who promised is faithful. Y'all, this is the role of our faith. It's to help us to hold on to the things that we cannot see, because our faith is anchored in a promise keeper. And when our faith is anchored, that delay hit differently. In that delay, with the kind of faith that I'm talking about, we're able to say things like, I don't know what day the Lord will deliver me, but I am confident that one day he will. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, in that last speech, I've been to the mountaintop, as he expressed his own familiarity with these three tools: the ability to see the bigger picture, to seek to desire him more than he desires the deliverance, and to see him fulfilling his promises. Dr. King expressed his own familiarity with these tools as he got to the closing remarks in this speech. And during this speech, as he highlighted how intense his delay was, waiting for the deliverance that we too are still waiting on, he spoke about the multiple attempts on his life and even the death threats that he was receiving while sitting in Memphis. Listen for how he saw the bigger picture when he said, well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. He saw the bigger picture, talking about being at the top of a mountaintop, looking over and seeing, oh, that's what all of this is leading up to. He saw a bigger picture. Listen for how he sought to desire God more than he desired the deliverance when he said, listen, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do the will of God. Look at how he was committed to seeking God more than he was focused on just trying to get the deliverance. As he got to his closing remarks, he hit the last tool. Listen for how he visualized God fulfilling his promise when he said, and he's allowed me to go up to the mountaintop, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, But I want you to know tonight that we as a people, we will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He visualized God fulfilling his promise. Now this is what it sounds like, y'all, when we recognize that our delay does not destroy us. It's not sent out to destroy us. It's sent out to develop us. And as I get closer to time, let us reflect momentarily on chapter 12. And we see in chapter 12 that his deliverance is always worth the wait. If you would turn in your Bible to chapter 12, verse 29, I'll give you a second because I know that was a jump. Or if you like, you can follow on the screen. But it says at midnight, somebody say at midnight. The Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all of the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, and he and all his servants and all of Egyptians, and they had a great cry, right, in Egypt. For there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night. Now, if somebody waking you up in the middle of the night at midnight, it must be important. Well, it is for me. Y'all don't wake me up at midnight if you ain't got nothing to say. So this is a serious matter for Pharaoh. He says, up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go. Serve the Lord. Y'all hear that? Did he just call God the Lord? Serve the Lord. Remember, sometimes the delay is so that others might see, that their sight might shift. Serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds and get out as you have said. Be gone. I love this part. And also, bless me. Bless me before you go. I want some of that goodness. Bless me. Y'all, God's deliverance is worth the wait. It's worth the wait for a few reasons. Number one, there's not a power that can stop it. It's worth the wait because it's going to happen as he said it would, and better. It's worth the wait because it is also connected to God's greater redemptive purposes. And God's deliverance is worth the wait because he will meet the deadline. He won't delay you any further. Now, why would I say that his deliverance is worth the wait? Because there's no power that can stop it. Well, think about Pharaoh here for a second in verse 29 through 30. The Lord has struck the firstborn of all things. Now, why the firstborn son, you might ask? It's because Pharaoh had a God complex. And in ancient Egyptian sources, each morning the Pharaoh would conduct this ritual called the rite of the house of the morning. A ritual believed to awaken the sun god, causing the sun to rise. As some commentators say, Pharaoh thought that he was the reason why the sun was coming up. He was the God that instructed the sun to rise. Other ancient Egyptian sources say that Pharaoh viewed himself as the son and representative of the supreme God, believing his firstborn would take on this role. So Pharaoh also thought himself and his son to be the sons of God, a title reserved for somebody else, if you know what I'm talking about. So Pharaoh had such a high view of himself. He was dipped in so much pride. Pharaoh's the last God that God tears down before the deliverance comes. And in him taking the firstborn, he's actually letting Pharaoh know that, brother, you're not who you think you are. You are no one's idol, and you are not greater than I am. He doesn't just take Pharaoh's firstborn, he takes the firstborn of the entire land just so everybody can know. There is no one that causes the sun to rise except me. There is no one, no son of God, that gives me instructions. There is no one except me. So Pharaoh's God complex shrivels, and he's humbled, realizing that this God of the Israelites has the power and the control of all life. So Pharaoh sought a blessing. And in doing so, he's recognizing that the Lord God is greater than he. A realization that only came, y'all, after he was broken. The same kind of brokenness that you might be experiencing in your delay. God's deliverance is worth the wait, because if Pharaoh couldn't stop it, then nobody can. God's deliverance is worth the wait because it's going to happen as he said it would. In verse 32 through 36, we see this clearly. He shows them again, you're not coming out with less than he's promised you. I'm not going to let you settle for just the men or just the women and kids or just the livestock. I'm not going to let you settle for that. You're going to come out like I said you would, with everything that I said you would have. A fulfillment of the words he spoke in chapter 3, 4, 6, and 11. You're going to plunder the Egyptians, and all of you will leave, my entire host. And that there is evidence to us that we also will have everything that he promised we would have. So if in your delay right now, in your momentary light affliction, as Paul would call it, remember that God has promised you a perfect peace if you keep your mind stayed on Jesus. And you will have that. Remember this abundant life that Christ said he came here to give us. You will have that. And remember this joy, this unspeakable joy. Remember everything that he said will belong to you. Because he's putting that on his character. His character that's so closely associated with his word. You will have everything that the Lord said. Just like Pharaoh's like, hey, as you have said, take all these things. What he's really referring to is as God told Moses to tell Pharaoh. So what he's really saying is as God said. And that's exactly what I'm trying to tell you today is as God said you will have. Just wait on him. There's a reality that we face a pretty real enemy. The same enemy that tried to oppose the Lord. This enemy would love to wear you down in your hardship. He would love for you to settle for less than what you are due just to get it over with. He would love for you to settle less than what you are due, but God's deliverance comes with more than you can bargain for. As highlighted, like we've said multiple times through Exodus chapter 11:2, and this next passage, Exodus 33 through 36. It's the same passage that highlights just how far the plundering of the Egyptians went. Now, the last thing that we see is that God's deliverance is ultimately connected to his greater redemptive purposes. What do you mean by that? Well, God told Abraham that he was going to bless all nations through him. All nations. And through Abraham's line comes Moses and the Israelites. But we don't just see the Israelites leaving Egypt now, do we? If we zoom into verse 38, we see a mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, and both flocks and herds. Now this mixed multitude numbered amongst the 600,000, just men, not counting women and children, so there'd probably been about 1.5 million. This mixed multitude is a group of diverse people groups that maybe included some Egyptians most likely, but it also could have been some of the other folks that Egypt had captive. So these were other foreigners that joined with the Israelites in the Exodus. Now, why is that important? It's important because of what God promised Abraham, that through him all nations would be blessed, not just Israel. So God had purpose in mind for Israelites' delay, for Egypt's suffering. He had purpose in mind. Those Egyptians whose sight shifted said, hey, can I go with you? Because I do want to follow this Yahweh God, this great God that I saw defeat all of the gods of Egypt. I want to go with you and learn of your ways and now become one of you. They are experiencing the Exodus as well. So what was God doing there? He's leveraging his relationship, his covenant with Israel, his marrying of Israel. He's leveraging that so that he can reach all nations. Israel, the people of God, the people of the deliverance, were supposed to be a missional people. And this is the beginning of what that looks like. I know I said last already, y'all forgive me. God's deliverance will meet the deadline. This takes me back to a time where I used to sing in church, it may not come when you want it, but it'll be there right on time. And the song broke out in the crowd. No, it didn't. This is the idea that it did come. It might have felt like it was a delay, but when it came quickly. As y'all see in verse 39, it says that they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. So when the time came, they had to go. They had to go. Y'all, God takes no pleasure in prolonging suffering. He takes no pleasure in that. And he has a day in mind where he will no longer delay his deliverance. This day, right, that Israel is celebrating, Moses specifically pins it down as the 430th day. And you saw all of this broke out at midnight. And Moses writes on that very day. When he writes on that very day, he's indicating the significance that it was on the very day. And if he's indicating significance, then it must mean that this was purposeful. And if it was purposeful, then it must mean that it was intentional. And if it's intentional because it's in the hands of God, then that must mean as well that he's intentional about every single day that you spend waiting on the deliverance. But it does come. It does come. Only God knows why the delay, and only he knows what day the deliverance will come. But our job, our role, is that we just be prepared. Just be prepared. Christ's deliverance from your hardship is coming. Are you prepared? Are you prepared with trust in your heart that's come from long suffering? Are you prepared with delight in your heart that's come from snuggling up at the feet of Jesus and listening to him respond to you in prayer? Are you prepared with purpose in your heart, knowing that, hey, I'm going through this for a reason, and it might not have nothing to do with me, but when I get out, I'm going to testify of his goodness? Are you prepared with contentment in your heart to say things like, I don't know if I'll get there. All I'm concerned about right now is doing the will of God. Christ's ultimate deliverance will come. His ultimate deliverance from all things stained by sin, that is coming. Are you prepared with him in your heart? If so, then hope in the gospel. Remember where you were when he delivered you. And if he can deliver you from the power of sin and death, he can deliver you from your current hardships as well. But if you find yourself unprepared today for Christ's deliverance, his restoration of all things, then I remind you, same is true. Believe in the gospel. Let Christ make his home in your heart. Believe in the gospel so that he can carry you on this journey to the promised land. It wasn't about what the Israelites could do to prepare themselves to leave. It's about what God had already done to prepare them to leave. He had already filled their stomachs. He already promised them that they would be leaving with resources. He already promised them that they would have favor in sight of all the people in the land. It was him doing the preparing. In the same way that it is him doing the preparing for you in your heart right now as he draws you to himself so that you can experience his promised land when he makes all things new. Jesus came because God promised. Jesus prepared us because God promised. He died and he rose because God promised, and all you have to do is believe that he promised that and did that for you. This is the word of the Lord, and ain't mine. If it was my hope and my promise and my words, it'd be nothing to stand on. But this is God's words, and God's words never fail. So hold tight to that during your delay, because you will see deliverance. Let's pray.